Johnny Carson ripped the veil off the Golden Age sirens who traded bedroom secrets for silver screen glory. For 30 long years, Johnny Carson stood as the undisputed monarch of late-night television, welcoming the entire American populace into his studio to share laughter and intimacy with Hollywood's most colossal titans. However, the moment the red recording lights dimmed and the spectators filed out, Carson often kept the dialogue alive within the sanctuary of his private office. Only this time the microphones were dead and the polite filters were completely stripped away. It was during these raw, off-the-record sessions that the meticulously fabricated legends of Tinseltown began to fray at the seams, exposing the grit beneath the glitter. Actresses who curated squeaky clean reputations for the press would suddenly spill the tea on the industry's most disturbing underbelly, shattering their innocent images. And absolutely no subject sparked more explosive confessions than the quid pro quo arrangements that constructed and demolished legacies during Hollywood's Gilded Era. Johnny held the keys to every skeleton in every closet, disclosed a former NBC executive who stood shoulder to shoulder with Carson throughout his late-night dominion. Celebrities would whisper details they would never dare utter into a camera lens, particularly after loosening up with a few stiff drinks at his legendary post-show gatherings. The bombshells they dropped regarding the true mechanics of the Dream Factory would have shaken the average American family to their very foundations. Carson cultivated an aura as the business's ultimate father confessor, forging a sanctuary where screen icons could finally admit the uncomfortable reality lurking behind their polished press releases. Whenever the chatter drifted toward how empires were actually forged in the studio days, the narratives exposed a brutal machine where acting chops frequently took a back seat to sexual availability. Carson grasped the chasm between Hollywood's glittering facade and its sordid backstage reality better than any soul alive, noted a one-time producer for The Tonight Show. He could pinpoint exactly which dynasties were founded on raw artistic merit, and which ones were constructed between the sheets. While he played the perfect gentleman on the broadcast behind closed doors, he was brutally honest about the predatory casting couch culture that served as the engine of the studio system. Tonight, we are tearing down the wall to expose the scandalous exchanges Johnny Carson witnessed in the shadows regarding 8 Golden Age icons whose road to glory required far more than just a pretty face and a script. We are not dealing with idle gossip or tabloid trash here. These are insights straight from the man who acted as the high priest of Hollywood's secrets. Prepare for the unvarnished truth about who really compromised their morals to climb the ladder and the heavy toll extracted for their triumphs. Long before she became the entity known as Marilyn Monroe, she was just another desperate starlet who could not seem to get a foot in the door. The lengths she went to next stunned even a cynic like Johnny Carson, who later divulged that practically every single part she landed came with a very private price tag attached. But before we dive deeper into the dirt, make sure to subscribe to Legacy Unmasked to uncover more hidden history. Now, we have to ask, was the legend of Marilyn Monroe truly built on calculated affairs? When Marilyn Monroe floated onto Johnny Carson's Tonight Show set in the early 1960s, the viewing public beheld the ultimate symbol of blonde ambition. She was radiant coy and appeared as if she had been genetically engineered for the spotlight, capturing hearts instantly. Yet Carson, possessing a radar for authenticity, saw right through the manufactured glitz to identify a far more tangled reality concerning Monroe's ascent to the top. In hush-hush discussions with his inner circle, Carson reportedly validated what the power players had whispered for decades but vehemently denied in public. Monroe's supersonic trajectory from a no-name model to a planetary obsession had been greased by strategic alliances with influential moguls who held the keys to her professional future. She beamed for the cameras, but the woman was absolutely drained the moment they cut. Carson allegedly confessed to a producer following one of her guest spots. Every major leap forward in her filmography was granted by a powerful man who demanded a physical repayment in return for his influence. It started with the photographers, moved on to the agents, and eventually reached the studio heads. That is simply the dirty, open secret of this town. Talent might nudge the gate ajar, but for countless women in that era, kicking it wide open required a very different kind of offering to the gatekeepers. According to insiders privy to Carson's candid breakdowns, he had confirmed via his vast web of contacts the truth about Monroe's alleged trysts with studio brass, including the infamous Daryl F. Zanuck at 20th Century Fox. These weren't just haphazard flings. They were deliberate tactical maneuvers on her chessboard of fame. Carson wasn't sitting there in judgment of her moral character, clarified a former staffer who sat in on several of these late-night debriefs about the star. He viewed her as a pragmatist who recognized the game was rigged and decided to play the corruption to her own benefit. In fact, he held a certain respect for her survival instincts. The world saw a dizzy blonde, but Johnny spotted the sharp, calculating intellect operating beneath the persona. What Carson found most captivating about the Monroe saga was how she managed to alchemize what started as exploitation into a weapon of absolute power. While her early days involved coercion by men who held her career hostage, she eventually mastered the art of weaponizing her allure to command respect in a business designed to keep women powerless. Johnny was convinced that Marilyn eventually flipped the script on them, explained a colleague who worked alongside the host during the 1970s. She began as a victim of the machine, but in the end she learned exactly how to make the machine work for her. To Johnny, the real heartbreak lay in how this cold, transactional way of handling relationships eroded her capacity to bond with people on a human level. By the time she had ascended to the ranks of true Hollywood royalty, the boundary between her scripted performances and her actual reality had dissolved into nothingness. The dark truths Carson held regarding Monroe's strategic bedroom alliances were far more than just idle backstage gossip. They were hard facts gathered from intimate late-night talks with the directors, producers, and co-stars who ran the machinery of Hollywood's golden age. The notorious casting couch was not some rare, unlucky incident for the desperate. It was a deeply entrenched, institutionalized system. It was the gatekeeping mechanism that ruthlessly decided which starry-eyed girls would see their names in lights and which would vanish into total obscurity. A former NBC executive noted that what truly captivated Carson wasn't just that Monroe played this dirty game, but how the game simultaneously constructed her legend and dismantled her soul. In his eyes, she was the tragic archetype of Tinseltown's corrosive touch, a beautiful creature rotted from the inside out by the industry. She was the woman who grabbed the brass ring and got everything she dreamed of, only to realize she had left her true self behind in the bargaining. Now Joan Crawford was a different breed entirely. She didn't just sleep her way up the ladder, she turned her affairs into a loaded weapon. Carson divulged that the screen legend kept a mental ledger of her powerful conquests, effectively turning the industry's system of exploitation back on its masters. She would famously say that the public image takes care of itself, but she was playing the role of the boss long before she actually owned the fleet. You have to recall that incredible trajectory of hers, rising from the grime of a factory floor to wielding immense power in a corporate boardroom. There were very few metamorphoses in show business history that impressed Johnny Carson more than Joan Crawford's spectacular evolution. It was a journey that took her from a destitute laborer to an Academy Award-winning icon and eventually a top-tier executive at Pepsi-Cola. When the cameras were off, Carson dished on how Crawford shrewdly leveraged intimate connections with both men and women to scale Hollywood's savage hierarchy. As Johnny reportedly quipped to his inner circle after she visited The Tonight Show, "Joan didn't just climb the ladder, folks, she bought the damn thing." This sentiment went beyond simple respect for her acting chops. It was an acknowledgement of how brilliantly she manipulated a machine built to chew women up. According to insiders privy to Carson's private chats, he understood that she had mastered the art of survival in a predatory environment. His knowledge came deep from the industry grapevine, revealing details about Crawford's rookie years when she was just another face in the crowd. She allegedly forged calculated alliances with the heavy hitters, directors, producers, and executives who held the keys to stardom. However, unlike the countless aspiring actresses who were crushed by the casting couch culture, Crawford was never the victim. Reports suggest she walked into those rooms with eyes wide open and a pragmatism that was as cold as it was effective. A former producer for the show explained that Johnny believed Joan was playing three-dimensional chess while the rest of the town was still figuring out checkers. Based on the lore from old Hollywood players, she maintained a meticulous internal list of which liaisons boosted her standing and which were dead ends. She wasn't merely sharing a bed with powerful men for the sake of a role, she was conducting business transactions. She was weaving a complex web of influence that in the end made her more formidable than many of the tycoons who thought they were using her. What Carson found particularly juicy were the whispers regarding Crawford's strategic maneuvers with women, not just the male power brokers. In an era where same-sex desires were kept under heavy lock and key, Crawford reportedly cultivated tight bonds with influential women who held the keys to social and professional circles. These connections weren't always sexual in nature, but they proved Crawford knew that the keys to the kingdom weren't held solely by the men in suits. They reflected her sharp awareness that power in Tinseltown was a currency that flowed through many hands regardless of gender. A writer from the 1970s staff recalled Carson saying that Joan's defining trait was her absolute refusal to ever be someone's prey. She grasped from the very beginning that in the studio system, intimacy was just another form of currency to be traded. Rather than fighting that grim reality, she became a master of it, treating her dalliances as strategic mergers rather than romances. This calculated hustle didn't stop once she became a star. It was a lifelong strategy for dominance. Carson's private take was that she stayed on top long after Hollywood usually discarded aging actresses by pivoting her charm offensive. She courted the gossip columnists, the critics, and eventually the corporate suits outside the traditional studio bubble to maintain her relevance. Her marriage to Pepsi CEO Alfred Steele wasn't just love, it was the ultimate power move securing her a throne in the business world. It was a relationship that granted her massive influence in the corporate sector just as her box office dominance began to fade. To Johnny Crawford represented the ultimate survivor, a woman who could walk through fire and come out holding a torch. He told his colleagues she was one of the rare few who saw the matrix of the game and refused to let it break her spirit. While her peers were often emotionally shattered by the transactional nature of the business, Joan kept her heart wrapped in steel. She maintained enough emotional distance to flip the script using those predatory dynamics to fuel her own rise to power. Carson's candid backstage thoughts on Crawford mirrored his deeper understanding of how the corrupt studio system actually functioned. It was a world where talent was merely the entry fee, but strategic personal relationships were the deciding factor in who became a legend and who was left behind. To Carson, Crawford's saga was more than just Hollywood gossip, it was a roadmap. It symbolized the rot at the core of the studio system, yet also proved one could navigate that treacherous machinery without being completely chewed up and spat out. There is a snapshot you will see where Cary Grant cheekily asks if her engine is purring. Let me tell you that motor wasn't just running, it was overheating. But speaking of facades, the nation's ultimate symbol of rugged American manhood was sitting on Tinseltown's most explosive classified file. Johnny held the keys to the vault regarding Rock Hudson's shady dealings with the studios and the titans he had to service to keep his stardom and his life intact. 3. Enter Rock Hudson, the manufactured heartthrob. Nothing captivated Johnny quite like the sheer scale of the fantasy built around Rock's name as the golden goose of the box office. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Hudson sold a dream of red-blooded virility to the masses, all while burying his true nature deep in the closet. When the cameras stopped rolling, Carson pieced together the gritty details of the dangerous and, frankly, disturbing bargains Hudson struck to keep the curtain from falling on his career. Johnny reportedly dropped a bombshell to a producer in the 1970s, quipping that while Rock might not be straight, his ambition certainly was. That biting remark perfectly encapsulated the trap Hudson was in, a gay man forcing himself to be the world's poster boy for ladies' men just to survive. Insiders privy to Carson's late-night confessions revealed that he had gathered intel through his vast network about the extreme lengths the powers that be went to in order to safeguard their investment, including setup. Dates with starlets, a completely fake marriage to his agent's secretary, and press releases spinning yarns about imaginary flings with leading ladies. We are not talking about little white lies here. This was a military-grade operation overseen by Hudson's notorious agent Henry Wilson alongside studio bosses who had poured millions of dollars into crafting a straight hero. A former writer for The Tonight Show noted that Johnny was obsessed with the industrial-level artifice required to build the entity known as Rock. He confided in his team that this went beyond simply keeping a secret hidden. It was about literally engineering a fake human being, complete with a backdated romantic history choreographed paparazzi moments and hired girlfriends for the red carpet. What really gnawed at Carson were the whispers regarding Hudson's beginnings and his twisted dynamic with Henry Wilson the Kingmaker, who plucked a truck driver named Roy Scherer Jr. from obscurity and sculpted him into the silver screen god Rock Hudson. Hollywood veterans who spilled the tea to Carson confirmed that Wilson was infamous for demanding payment in the form of flesh from his young male protégés. Carson was convinced that Hudson had signed his name in blood on a Faustian contract right at the start, according to an ex-NBC executive. Piecing together the gossip, Johnny understood that Hudson's ticket to fame was likely punched through bedroom doors, sleeping with Wilson and other heavy hitters who held the keys to the kingdom. This went far beyond merely maintaining discretion about his private life. It was about total submission to a predatory system. This was the brutal reality for gay actors in the Golden Age. The choice was binary: erase your identity to climb the ladder, or live your truth and watch your career burn to ash. For Hudson, chasing the limelight meant agreeing to a life sentence of pretense with an army of studio fixers, handlers, and suits, all conspiring to maintain the illusion that kept the cash registers ringing. A close associate mentioned that Johnny viewed Hudson's life as perhaps the industry's greatest tragedy. He had the world at his feet, yet he paid for it by forfeiting any chance at real love or honesty. Even when he was the undisputed king of the lot, he lived with the sword of Damocles hanging over his head, terrified one slip would destroy the empire. Carson's fascination with the Hudson saga wasn't born of malice, but rather an obsession with the massive void between the glossy PR myths and the messy, dark truths they covered up. Rock's existence was the ultimate symptom of this disease, a man whose entire being was a product manufactured to satisfy ticket buyers and shareholders. The aspect that Johnny found most telling about the whole charade wasn't the lie itself, but the sheer number of people on the payroll who helped tell it. Moguls, producers, fellow actors, the press, dozens were in on the secret, but they kept their mouths shut to protect the bottom line. It laid bare the rot at the core of the star system, exposing how everyone was complicit. It is a silent scream. Where were my mentors? Why didn't anyone save me? They couldn't. And while her 7 trips down the aisle sold papers, Carson knew Lana Turner's love life was just as strategically engineered. Every dotted line she signed her name to came with a set of invisible stipulations he would whisper to his confidants. And it was precisely those shadowy agreements that cemented her status as one of Tinseltown's most formidable matriarchs. Number 4. Lana Turner, the Sweater Girl's tactical romances. Whenever the dazzling Lana Turner graced the set of The Tonight Show throughout the 1960s and 70s, audiences were mesmerized by a silver screen deity whose chaotic private existence, defined by 7 trips down the aisle and the grisly slaying of her gangster beau Johnny Stompanato by her own adolescent daughter, frequently eclipsed her actual cinematic achievements. Yet the host, Johnny Carson, with his deep-rooted network of industry insiders, perceived a far more intricate reality regarding Turner's ascension to stardom. The tabloids say she had 7 husbands, he mused. But the truth is, the industry itself was the 8th and the most demanding of them all. This was the sentiment Carson reportedly shared with his trusted entourage following one of the blonde bombshell's guest spots. That remark was far more than a witty one-liner. It was an astute acknowledgement of how Turner's love life, both the headlines and the hushed affairs, had sculpted her career path. From her legendary, perhaps apocryphal discovery at Schwab's Pharmacy to becoming the golden goose of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer romance was her currency. Sources close to the late-night kingpin revealed that he had gathered intel on Turner's calculated maneuvering within the dating pool from her very first days in the business. What the naive public devoured as a whirlwind of torrid love affairs were often shrewd chess-like moves, with Turner aligning herself with powerful men capable of elevating her rank at MGM and locking down superior scripts. Johnny was convinced that Lana possessed a mind far more tactical than the fragile image she projected to the world. A former producer from The Tonight Show later clarified. Piecing together gossip from the old guard, he realized that many of her unions, particularly the early ones, were forged with a crystal-clear blueprint of the professional doors they would unlock. To be fair, this survival strategy wasn't exclusive to Turner. It was the standard playbook for any woman with ambition inside the studio machine, but Lana played the game with a master's finesse, leveraging intimacy for advancement like no other. What set Turner apart in Carson's private estimation was her uncanny knack for flipping the script, turning potential exploitation into a weapon of influence. While she initially faced the same predatory casting couch demands as countless aspiring starlets, she rapidly evolved, becoming highly discriminatory about her partners, zeroing in on men who could deliver tangible power rather than just succumbing to pressure. Carson viewed Turner as a survivor who had cracked the code of Hollywood's silent laws, observed a former executive from the NBC network. He mentioned to associates that she grasped a hard truth very young inside the studio gates. A romance wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a merger and acquisition. Rather than resisting that cold reality, she leaned into it, manipulating the dynamic until it served her ambitions. This methodological approach reportedly didn't stop at executives. It bled into her interactions with directors and leading men alike. Carson had heard whispers from various corners about how Turner would cultivate alliances with directors who knew how to light her properly, or male leads whose nod of approval guaranteed her top billing. These entanglements weren't designed for longevity or happily ever afters, but were often targeted strikes to achieve a specific career milestone. Johnny actually respected her grit. I recalled a staff writer active during the 1970s era. He noted that Turner never made the mistake of confusing business with pleasure. She navigated her profession with eyes wide open, fully aware of the industry's gears, refusing to feign belief in a meritocracy when she knew damn well that casting decisions were driven by factors having little to do with acting chops. Turner's maneuvers were a mirror of the restricted choices available to women under the studio system, a world where the gavel of power was wielded solely by men. In such a stifling climate, calculated intimacy was one of the solitary channels through which an actress could exert any real gravity over her own destiny. While a modern lens might look askance at relationships built on transactions, Carson reportedly viewed these arrangements with nuance, judging them against the harsh backdrop of that era. What truly captivated Carson regarding the Lana Turner saga was her absolute refusal to be a pawn on someone else's board, the former producer explained. At a time when women were traded like baseball cards, she carved out a way to snatch back the reins and dictate her own rise to glory. Her tactics might seem controversial now, but they were a fierce act of rebellion in a system engineered to keep women powerless. Don't forget to subscribe to Legacy Unmasked for more deep dives into Hollywood history. Moving on to a darker tale, studio mogul, Harry Cohn dominated every facet of Rita. Hayworth's existence dictating everything from her romantic partners and her physical appearance to which powerful men she was required to host after the sun went down. Carson referred to this situation as the industry's most unsettling open secret. Number 5. Rita Hayworth dancing to Columbia's puppeteer strings. There are few metamorphoses in cinema history more drastic than the reconstruction of Margarita Cancino into Rita Hayworth, the ethereal love goddess who defined the 1940s. Yet lurking beneath this stunning reinvention was a harrowing narrative of absolute domination and abuse that it was through hushed late-night conversations with industry veterans, people who had actually been in the room, that Johnny Carson finally grasped the full dark picture. The entire world may have been captivated by her dancing, but there was only one man pulling the strings and calling the tune. Carson allegedly confided to his inner circle while reflecting on the tragic trajectory of Rita Hayworth. He was referring, of course, to Harry Cohn, the infamous iron-fisted ruler of Columbia Pictures, whose domination over Hayworth stands as perhaps the most disturbing case study of how the studio system preyed upon its leading ladies. According to individuals deeply acquainted with the topics Johnny discussed in private, the late-night host had uncovered unsettling specifics regarding Cohn's obsession with micromanaging nearly every breathing moment of the starlet's existence. The manipulation started with the physical erasure of her identity, initiating a grueling transformation process that included excruciating electrolysis treatments designed to painfully push back her hairline to alter her ethnic look, alongside harsh chemical dyes meant to change her from a natural brunette into a fiery redhead. They even stripped away her birth name to bury her Spanish roots. But the control didn't stop at her image, it bled into her romances and her day-to-day movements. Johnny was genuinely rattled by the stories he heard regarding Cohn's behavior toward Rita, a former producer from The Tonight Show later revealed. Drawing from candid discussions with former employees who walked the halls of Columbia Pictures during that golden era, Carson came to the realization that the studio mogul didn't just see Hayworth as a contract player, but essentially as his own private chattel. This went far beyond managing movie roles. Cohn was dictating her romantic partners, approving which parties she was allowed to grace, and even policing her behavior behind closed doors. Perhaps the most chilling details Carson picked up on involved the rumors of Cohn's obsession with electronic espionage against his own stars. As told by industry insiders who felt safe enough to speak freely with the host, Cohn reportedly went so far as to plant listening devices throughout Hayworth's private residence, allowing him to eavesdrop on her most intimate conversations to catch any disparaging remarks about the studio or unauthorized romances. This level of intrusion was staggering, an extraordinary violation of privacy that perfectly illustrated Cohn's manic determination to possess every single facet of his most lucrative female asset's life. Carson felt strongly that the dynamic between Rita and the studio wasn't just business, it had curdled into something much darker and more sinister, noted a one-time executive at NBC. Piecing together accounts from various reliable sources, Johnny grasped the ugly truth that Rita's big break and her sustained stardom at Columbia were tied to silent, predatory expectations regarding her. Willingness to be available not just to Cohn, but to other heavy hitters. He wanted to curry favor with treating her company as a currency to be traded. Such a sordid arrangement highlights the absolute unchecked authority that studio moguls commanded during the peak of Hollywood's golden age. In the grip of the studio system, talent was shackled by ironclad long-term contracts, granting men like Cohn total dominion over their careers and public personas. For women in Hayworth's position, saying no to a boss's request, whether it was about a script or something personal, could lead to immediate suspension without a paycheck banishment to B-movie hell or the total annihilation of their career through carefully planted smear campaigns. Johnny viewed Rita as perhaps the quintessential tragedy of that town, observed a colleague who worked side by side with the legendary host. He often remarked to friends that she had signed away her autonomy in exchange for the spotlight, only to realize too late that the cost was infinitely steeper than she ever imagined. By the moment she commanded enough star power to actually fight back against Cohn's tyranny, the cycle of exploitation was already too deeply ingrained to break. Carson's deep fascination with Hayworth's narrative was rooted in his overarching interest in the brutal human toll that Tinseltown exacts on its idols. Sitting in the unique seat of being the entertainment industry's confessor-in-chief, he gathered a treasure trove of insights regarding the chasm between the glossy public image and the messy private reality of the stars. And in his eyes, Rita Hayworth was the ultimate heartbreaking example of this severe disconnect. She was a woman revered as an ethereal love goddess on the silver screen, yet treated with less dignity than a piece of office furniture once the cameras stopped rolling. What struck Johnny most about the Hayworth situation wasn't simply Cohn's predation, explained a former staff writer. It was the sheer number of people who stood by and let it happen. You had producers, celebrated directors, and fellow executives, scores of individuals who watched him demean her but kept their mouths shut, knowing that crossing Cohn was a one-way ticket to unemployment. It laid bare the rot at the very core of the studio system. But the shadows didn't just hide the fate of women. Tyrone Power's pristine matinee idol image concealed one of Hollywood's most precarious secrets. Carson would later reveal how the actor navigated a dangerous double life, allegedly engaging in affairs with power players of both sexes, all while upholding the masculine facade that kept the box office receipts flowing. I really couldn't say. You must be reeling from the shock of the exposure. Oh, hardly. It's mere curiosity. You certainly went to great lengths to secure the 6. The secret bargains of matinee idol Tyrone Power. Possessing devastatingly good looks and a magnetic charisma, Tyrone Power was the archetype of the classic Hollywood leading man throughout the 1930s and 40s, headlining swashbuckling adventures and sweeping romances that secured his place as the era's ultimate heartthrob. Yet Johnny Carson, privy to the whispers and confidential talks with the industry veterans who knew what lay beneath Power's meticulously crafted veneer, recognized the complicated and often compromising reality of his ascent. He was the studio's golden boy in more ways than the public ever guessed, Carson reportedly quipped to associates when the topic of Power's career arose. For more hidden truths from Hollywood's vault, subscribe to Legacy Unmasked. This specific observation offered a revealing glimpse into the intelligence Johnny had gathered regarding Tyrone's calculated maneuvers within the executive corridors of 20th Century Fox. It involved intimate alliances with power players that transcended traditional gender boundaries, highlighting the actor's ruthless pragmatism when it came to climbing the Hollywood ladder. Individuals within Johnny's inner circle who were privy to his confidential thoughts confirmed that he had received intelligence from numerous industry veterans regarding this matter. The consensus among these sources was that Tyrone possessed an open willingness to forge beneficial bonds with influential brokers, regardless of whether they were men or women, to secure his professional trajectory. These were never splashy public affairs designed for the tabloids, but rather shadowy, discreet transactions. They were conducted with the full silent knowledge of studio bosses who prioritized his massive ticket sales above all else, provided his image as a heterosexual heartthrob remained completely untarnished. One former producer from The Tonight Show remarked that Johnny often felt Tyrone grasped the dark, unwritten statutes of Tinseltown far better than his contemporaries ever could. Drawing from the whispers of Golden Age insiders, it became apparent that Tyrone realized early on that his breathtaking physical beauty was a currency. He recognized that his looks could be leveraged to build strategic bridges with influential heavyweights of both sexes, effectively fast-tracking his rise to stardom. While the adoring masses saw only the swashbuckling hero and the dashing romantic lead, the reality behind the velvet curtain was far more intricate and layered. According to Johnny's private musings, what set Tyrone's circumstances apart from the tragic tales of others was the silent nodding approval embedded within the studio machinery itself. Unlike peers such as Rock Hudson, who were forced to bury their true selves deep underground, Tyrone operated under a unique treaty. The studio moguls knew of his dalliances, but were too enamored with the revenue he generated to intervene, opting instead to shield his private life from public scrutiny. A former executive at NBC noted that Johnny viewed Tyrone not as a victim, but as a shrewd negotiator who had hammered out a sophisticated, albeit delicate compromise with the powers that be. He confided in his staff that Tyrone had essentially shaken hands on a devil's bargain with the industry titans. He would uphold the fantasy, the idol who made women in the audience faint, and in return he was afforded specific liberties behind closed doors, provided those doors remained firmly locked. This silent agreement reportedly covered what were euphemistically termed private auditions meetings with high-ranking directors and producers that allegedly ventured far past professional script readings into realms of personal intimacy. Old-school Hollywood veterans who spoke openly with Johnny confirmed that these clandestine connections were instrumental. They directly paved the way for superior casting choices and preferential treatment within the rigid hierarchy of the studio system. A writer who served on The Tonight Show staff during the 1970s recalled that Johnny held a strange admiration for Tyrone's skill in steering his ship through such shark-infested waters without capsizing. He once observed that Tyrone had successfully balanced the industry's insatiable commercial appetite with his own private desires. He managed to avoid the devastating psychological fracture that destroyed so many other souls, forced to live a total fabrication. It certainly wasn't freedom in the modern sense, but in that restrictive era, it was a functional truce, a survival strategy when few other doors were open. Tyrone's methodology highlighted the brutally narrow set of options available to performers whose romantic orientations defied the strict expectations of the time. In an era when being outed as gay or bisexual was a death sentence for one's career, calculated secrecy, rather than honest transparency, was often the only lifeline a star could grab. The former producer explained that what truly captivated Johnny about this saga wasn't merely the personal sacrifices involved. It was how the situation exposed the foundational deceit and double standards upon which the entire studio system was built. These corporations, which meticulously drafted morality clauses and marketed their stars as shining beacons of American virtue, were simultaneously facilitating illicit behaviors that stood in direct opposition to the very myths they peddled. As long as the cash registers rang and the arrangements remained profitable, the executives were more than happy to look the other way. This brings us to a sentiment often whispered in the shadows. I may not be able to act, but I certainly know how to keep men happy. Johnny often recounted what Ava Gardner whispered to him after the cameras stopped rolling, revealing why that single moment of candor cemented her legacy as the industry's most dangerously honest star. Item number 7 takes us to the gaming tables. Alberto is currently holding a fantastic bank. It is about time, considering that just last night that Greek fellow took him for everything he was worth, including a South American jungle. Laughter ensues. Coming in at number 7 is the legendary Ava Gardner, a beacon of raw, unfiltered honesty in a world built entirely on pretense and smoke. Of all the cinematic titans Johnny sat across from during his decades on air, very few left a mark on him quite like Ava did, primarily due to her disarming frankness. She was a breathtaking beauty whose volatile love affairs with icons like Frank Sinatra and Howard Hughes garnered just as many headlines as her film performances. Yet she possessed a refreshing refusal to play the game, acknowledging the gritty mechanics of Hollywood even when they clashed with the polished fairy tales the studios preferred. Sources close to the host revealed that Ava's time on the show rarely ended at the commercial break. She would often retreat to Johnny's office to share unpolished, gritty war stories about her experiences in the studio system once the recording light flickered off. It was precisely during one of these intimate, off-the-record sessions that Gardner reportedly leaned in and delivered her most infamous confession. "I was a terrible actress," she allegedly admitted without a hint of shame, "but I was magnificent in bed." A former producer who witnessed these late-night confessionals noted that Johnny didn't doubt her for a second. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden history, make sure to subscribe to Legacy Unmasked for more untold stories. We are dedicated to peeling back the curtain on the legends you thought you knew. Stay tuned to Legacy Unmasked, where the truth is always more fascinating than the fiction. It wasn't that Johnny dismissed her acting abilities. In fact, Carson genuinely believed she possessed a raw, natural gift. But he knew her initial break had less to do with monologues and more to do with her breathtaking face and her willingness to navigate the bedroom politics of the industry. What truly floored the late-night host was her brutal refusal to hide. The ugly truth, especially in an era when every other starlet was fiercely peddling the fairy tale that Tinseltown was a merit-based paradise. This refreshing bluntness reportedly grew out of her unorthodox origins. Unlike the legions of hopefuls who flocked to Los Angeles desperate to create art, she was plucked from obscurity simply because a studio scout happened to walk past her brother-in-law's photography display. Because she stumbled into fame by sheer accident rather than clawing for it, she was able to look at the studio machinery with a cynical, detached clarity that others lacked. According to the former NBC executive, Carson viewed her as the only person in town who wasn't drinking the Kool-Aid. He would tell his inner circle that she knew the score from day one. The studio system traded in more than just box office receipts. Acting chops were one form of currency, sure, but physical allure, raw sex appeal, and knowing exactly whose arm to hold were just as valuable at the exchange counter. While her peers exhausted themselves pretending their rise was due solely to hard work and grit, she privately nodded to the grim reality of how women actually ascended the ladder. This stark pragmatism was the foundation of her high-profile entanglements with some of the biggest titans in the entertainment world. In Carson's private estimation, these weren't just whirlwind romances. They were calculated power moves that showcased her deep understanding of where the real leverage lay in Hollywood. Her unions with Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and Frank Sinatra weren't random. Each marriage linked her to a man holding a distinct and powerful key to the kingdom's hierarchy. A writer who spent time on The Tonight Show in the 1970s recalled that Johnny secretly admired her tactical brilliance. He was convinced that behind the wild child tabloid persona sat a cold, calculating mind that knew exactly what it was doing with every connection it made. These affairs demonstrated a masterclass in social climbing, proving she understood that proximity to the throne was the fastest way to secure her own crown. What set her apart from the rest of the pack? Based on Carson's observations, was her absolute refusal to play along with the industry's favorite lie about talent rising to the top naturally. While countless actresses who slept their way up later rewrote their histories to sound like stories of artistic struggle, she maintained a shocking level of candor about the various levers she pulled to get where she was. A former producer explained that Carson felt this honesty made her a legitimate threat to the studio establishment. The entire Hollywood marketing machine relied on the myth that stars were born from pure talent and the love of the audience. Her willingness to admit that seduction and transactional relationships were part of the job description threatened to tear down that carefully curated curtain. That is precisely why the executives fought so hard to script every word their stars said, and why her unfiltered nature was such a rare anomaly. This brutal self-assessment didn't stop at her love life. It extended to her professional skills as well. In a town where mediocre performers demanded to be treated like high art, she knew exactly what she brought to the table and what she didn't. This lack of delusion deeply impressed Carson, who was exhausted by interviewing celebrities with egos the size of sound stages. A close colleague noted that Johnny found her absence of pretense to be a breath of fresh air. In a business built entirely on smoke and mirrors, she was the one person who refused to lie to herself about the compromises she made to survive. That authenticity made her a captivating guest, and ironically, it gave her screen presence a weight that she never gave herself credit for. Her acting carried a grit and reality that the technically perfect but dishonest actors could never quite replicate. Long before he was dubbed the King of Hollywood, Clark Gable was essentially the industry's most premium date for hire. Carson eventually uncovered the sordid details of the arrangement that bought Gable his career, a deal the MGM bosses coldly referred to as their smartest purchase ever. I need to apologize for my behavior last night. I was 3 sheets to the wind and completely swept away by your beauty. Segment 8, The King's Shadowy Apprenticeship. Few makeovers in cinema history were as drastic as Clark Gable's leap from a broke, struggling stagehand to the ultimate screen idol. He became the rugged, masculine ideal that drove female audiences wild and served as the studio's golden goose for nearly 20 years. But behind that rapid ascent lay a dark history of strategic alliances and quiet humiliations that Johnny Carson pieced together through whispered conversations with the old guard who saw it happen. The guy had to earn every role twice. Carson reportedly told his associates, once in front of the camera and once behind closed doors. It was a biting observation that hinted at the secret cost required to subscribe to Legacy Unmasked and uncover the truth. Johnny uncovered the gritty truth about Gable's rookie years in Tinseltown back when the starving artist allegedly forged some very convenient alliances. We are talking about intimate bonds with heavy hitters, most notoriously a certain older matriarch of the industry, who took a rather keen personal interest in the dashing young hopeful. According to insiders privy to Johnny's off-camera banter, he had gathered intel from numerous veterans regarding Gable's entanglement with Mina Wallace, not just an agent, but a power broker and sister to the legendary producer Hal Wallace. The grapevine suggested this dynamic was far more intimate than a standard client-manager arrangement, venturing into romantic territory that drastically fast-tracked Clark's entry into the inner circle, unlocking doors to prestige projects and A-list directors that were previously bolted shut. Johnny reportedly felt that Gable's ascent involved some calculated moral trade-offs, a chapter of history the superstar later fought tooth and nail to scrub from his official life story, as revealed by a one-time producer for The Tonight Show. Piecing together the lore from Hollywood old-timers, Carson realized that Gable's first big break wasn't just luck. It came through liaisons with potent figures who were captivated by the young heartthrob's charisma and were eager to pull strings to keep him close. However, what set the king apart from the countless others who traded favors for fame was how masterfully he eventually rose above these shady beginnings. Carson noted that the moment Gable secured undeniable stardom through the massive audience love for hits like It Happened One Night and Gone with the Wind, he systematically ghosted the very patrons who had paved his way, meticulously sculpting a fresh legend that highlighted his raw talent and magnetic appeal while burying the connections that gave him his start. The former NBC executive observed that Johnny viewed Gable as a man who had reconciled with his history without letting it shackle him. He mentioned to his team that Clark had effectively walled off those early days, privately accepting the dirty work. Required to survive while publicly selling the image of the rugged self-made icon that fans adored, a persona that fit his on-screen heroes perfectly. This talent for self-reinvention reportedly seeped into how Gable handled the studio heads and directors. Insiders who spilled the tea to Carson claimed the actor's early eagerness to please the power players morphed into a steely dominance once he realized just how much money his face could print. The naive youngster, who was allegedly kept on a leash by certain producers, vanished, replaced by an entrenched superstar who held all the cards and dictated his own contract terms. A staff writer from The Tonight Show era in the 1970s recalled that Johnny actually admired Gable's psychological toughness. He once remarked that the actor had managed to exploit the corrupt system without letting it rot his soul, making the necessary devil's bargains to pry the door open, yet keeping enough grit to prove he truly belonged at the top. Very few who bartered their dignity early on managed to pivot so gracefully. Gable's path highlighted both the scarce avenues open to dreamers during Hollywood's golden age and the sheer willpower needed to turn a scandalous start into a legendary legacy. No matter how a star was born in a town where beautiful faces were a dime a dozen, but opportunities were guarded by a tiny cabal of iron-fisted gatekeepers, cultivating strategic bedfellows was often the solitary route to getting a foot in the door. The former producer explained that what truly captivated Carson about Gable's story was his metamorphosis from a man utilizing romance as a ladder into a titan whose skill and charisma made him indisputably worthy of his throne, unlike the flashes in the pan who never evolved. Past their initial allure, Gable grew into his boots, working like a dog to sharpen his acting chops, honing that signature screen presence, and eventually becoming so colossal an asset to MGM that the wisps were drowned out by the roar of